35 years, closer to 50 now, and yet so much more, as though it belonged to another lifetime, someone else's lifetime, not mine anymore. I feel cut in half, cut off from my past, since, no, can't remember. Too old. Today on the Comic Book Report, Monster-Sized Hellboy by Mike Mignola from Dark Horse. Stick around and check it out. Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I'm excited to be back in the world of Dark Horse Comics, taking a look at a Dark Horse classic. That's right, we're in the world of Hellboy today, and to that end we are reviewing the Monster-Sized Hellboy. Now, I did do a quick overview of this book a couple weeks or months ago now at this point, where I talked a little bit about it because it was the biggest book in my collection. It is a towering book at over 1,500 pages. It is just absolutely massive. This edition boasts all the main storyline issues and stories in the Hellboy franchise, not including the short stories or any of the spin-off works, but if you're looking for your main canon Hellboy story, you can find it all within this monster-sized edition. I'm really eager to talk about this series today, but before we jump in, just a huge thank you to Dark Horse for sending over this review copy in exchange for this honest review. And a quick shout out to the channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. If you're looking to pick up your own comic book collected editions, perhaps this very book, I encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link for it in this video's description, and if you see anything there you like, you can use my discount code at checkout, TheComicBookReport, to save $2 off of your order. Please note if you use my affiliate link or code to make a purchase, I will earn a small commission, but it's a great way to support the channel. And now, let's get started. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The comics in this volume were written and illustrated primarily by Mike Mignola. The comics in this volume were published by Dark Horse beginning in 1994. The volume itself collects all the stories and graphic novels contained in Hellboy Omnibus Volumes 1 through 4. And finally, this is an oversized hardcover edition with beautiful glossy print paper stock, a sewn binding, and a total of 1,512 pages. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. I'd also like to do a mature content warning. This series has instances of nudity, violence, and more. I will try to be sensitive with how I cut around, particularly the nudity for the course of this video, but reader discretion is advised. Okay, and here's our first dedicated look at the front cover for today's edition. So this is the Monster-Sized Hellboy. As far as I know, this is a unique piece from Mignola for this release, and as you can probably tell, it is an oversized hardcover edition. In fact, it stands about as tall as a library edition if I'm not mistaken, and it's just absolutely massive. I should note as well that this does not have any dust jacket or slipcase, it is just the hardback book itself. On the spine of this collection, we do have a really crisp design. It's a field of black with, of course, Monster-Sized Hellboy, a little face of Hellboy, Mike Mignola, and others, and then the Dark Horse Comics logo at the bottom. I really think that this is a striking visual. It looks absolutely incredible from the spine. I think overall Dark Horse really nailed it here. And on the back cover, we do have a kind of black and white version of the image on the front cover. There's no real text here or anything other than the kind of pricing, logo, all the stuff like that at the bottom. I think when I first opened up this edition, there might have been a little piece of paper along the back, but once you take that off, it's just this plain back here. But I do think it's a really striking design. I really enjoy it. Overall, really nice touches here from Dark Horse. Okay, and now to answer a question I'm sure I'll be getting, how is the binding in this book? So as I mentioned, it is a sewn binding, and for my read through, the binding was absolutely extraordinary. As you can see, it has a massive eye, so the pages all lay down relatively flat, and with kind of white edging along a lot of it, there was really no gutter loss at all for me, at least in my read through, and I found that absolutely phenomenal. But as always, of course, you can watch as I do my flip through and inspect the binding for yourself as I go. And now, as we finish that look on the binding, I did want to go ahead and do some size comparisons here with some other notable formats. To do that, I do have this Monster-Sized Hellboy edition next to a Daredevil omnibus. This, of course, is the Chip Zdarsky and Marco Cocchetto omnibus, Volume 1. And I also have the Helen of Windhorn standard size hardcover, of course that work from Tom King and Bilquis Evley. I have reviewed both of these titles on my channel before in case you want to check them out, but why I did this is because I have essentially a standard size hardcover format and an oversized omnibus size format, again just to give you an idea of how massive this book is. I would say it stands about as tall as a library edition. I know that format can have some different dimensions here or there, but some of the other Dark Horse library editions stand pretty tall next to this as well. But I think when you pair that with just the absolute massive page count, this book just feels even larger than this video is really adequately showing. You know what, let's go ahead and grab one of those Dark Horse Library Editions. So this is Hellboy next to the Library Edition of Umbrella Academy Volume 1. As you can see, the trim size or height is about identical here. Again, I think Hellboy just looks all that more massive just because of the page count as well when paired with just the massive Library Edition size. At any rate, I just wanted to give you a size comparison here just so you can know roughly how large this book really is. And yes, if you're curious, I did do a review of this Umbrella Academy book as well on the channel that you can check out. Okay, and with that taken care of, we can go ahead and jump into the collection itself. After some black end pages, we have a title page, publication information page, and then we go straight into a table of contents. This table of contents is page numbered, and it breaks it down by the story arcs, which I love to see, and after that, we basically jump right into the book. I should mention as well, if you didn't notice it, this also has a sewn red ribbon in it that made a lovely bookmark for my entire read-through. Really like it. It's absolutely a nice feature to add to a collection like this. And after that, like I said, we jump right into the first story arc, the first chapter of it, and that should be also a formatting note I mentioned here. We don't really have individual issue covers. We have story arc kind of title breaks and then chapter breaks within that, and we have those little end pages you can see here. That's how they really kind of curate the collection. I would have loved to see maybe original covers, but I still think that the reading experience was, again, nice and curated. I love the formatting we still got here. I still thought it was really easy to find my way through which story I was in, you know, like the indexing of everything with the table of contents, everything just moved really seamlessly. And with that, we can really just jump right into this book. And I should say right from the top, before I got this Monster-Sized Hellboy, I really had not delved really deeply into the world of Hellboy. I've seen him in some crossovers more recently, like when I read and reviewed the first collection of The Goon. I know there was a Hellboy crossover issue. Culturally, I'm aware of him, but my real touchstone for this property prior to getting this collection was actually watching the two Guillermo del Toro films from the early 2000s with Ron Perlman. I really enjoyed those movies quite a bit. You know, I watched them as I was coming up as like a preteen or teenager, and I just really enjoyed it. And I really thought that that was kind of the beginning and end of what Hellboy was. Of course, I was vaguely aware that he was a comic book property, but I never really ventured into that source material until I received Monster-Sized Hellboy. And wow, I was really surprised what I found in the pages here. On one hand, I do think that those Del Toro adaptations were pretty suitable as far as adapting his nature, this character, and parts of this world, but I also will say it really fell woefully short of getting the scope of what the Hellboy universe really does, even within his own self-titled series here. But let me go ahead and back up. Whether you've seen the films or not, if you're just blank slate walking into the Hellboy comics, what can you really expect? Well, essentially, Hellboy is kind of at least half demon-looking creature who is basically summoned to the Earth during, I think, around World War II in a kind of occult ritual gone bad or right. It's kind of hard to say, but basically he's found by this scientist who basically takes him in and raises him just as a boy. He gives him a quick nickname of Hellboy. The moniker sticks, and he's raised in this environment by this kind of researcher, scientist, field worker guy who gets involved with this organization or agency known as the BPRD, which researches the paranormal and things like that, helps safeguard the rest of the world from supernatural, occult, kind of mystical threats. And this is the backdrop in which Hellboy is brought up or raised. And at the time the series is set, it's mostly, I believe, in the 90s. So between, World War II and 90s, it's been at the time like 50 years. But for him, he doesn't really age maybe as fast as humans do. And he's just really spent his whole life in this environment where he's stopping other kind of monstrous things or creatures. And he's a really interesting kind of glib individual where everything kind of washes off of him. He doesn't really get too bogged down by anything. And even though he is kind of a half monster himself, he doesn't really rattle at all. He's very nonchalant about kind of everything. He has an interesting kind of tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic kind of air about him, and he really diffuses a lot of what could be just straight-up horror in this title, and it really kind of rides the line between horror, action, dark fantasy, all in one. But I do think Hellboy himself really helps with that tension and that tone, because we have these really kind of gothic, horrific elements, but it's juxtaposed with this character who visually is like a monster, but when you get his dialogue and his personality, it's really kind of just glib humor, and it just works. He's really kind of a salt of the earth, almost blue-collar kind of worker who will just shrug off the trappings of all this like fate, destiny, and just grotesque happenings, and just tries to get through it all. For being someone that is, again, visually so monstrous, that may or may not have just this kind of horrific destiny just out of view, he is one of the most humane characters I've read in comics in quite some time. But anyway, going back to the story bits, we have him working as part of this BPRD agency, just kind of helping stop these threats. The first story arc has this kind of ancestral home and these kind of creepy frog monster human hybrid like creatures. It kind of really veers into cosmic horror as well, even in that early story arc. But that's really the first part of the Hellboy universe. It really introduces us to his origin, how he got on this earthly plane, how he was brought up, the organization he works with, some of his comrades or peers like Abe Sapien, who's kind of a creature from the Black Lagoon kind of creature. We have a golem at one point. We have some human characters, one that has a kind of pyrokinesis. And anyway, we're introduced to the BPRD, which eventually will get its own spin-off series in the world of the Mignola-verse here at Dark Horse. But for the intents and purposes of this Hellboy story, all you really need to know is that he works with this agency and these characters, and he gets into all sorts of exploits and misadventures, all of which really, again, are around kind of cosmic horror or dark fantasy. It deals with a lot of interesting kind of mythology, folk tales and lore as well. Like at one point we have Baba Yaga, at one point we have kind of mermaids, at one point again we have kind of extraterrestrial cosmic threats from different dimensions, and so much more. Obviously Hellboy is also earmarked for just being one of the most visually and stylistically stunning pieces of comic book history. You can look at this and immediately feel that this is really something set apart. And while we have a couple different artists taking their turns here in the Hellboy run, Mignola is a huge part of that visual style, and I think he's the most iconic kind of just quintessential depiction we have of Hellboy. This book and this series in general is just too massive for me to go into every little story and plot bit, but let me give you the overall shape. After his times in the BPRD, there is actually a moment where we find him kind of leaving the organization, and he just begins traveling on his own. This is really brought upon by a couple things. We have kind of seems like a kind of corruption within the BPRD. Basically, he finds out that one of his colleagues has a kind of bomb embedded in him, for lack of a better term. and he just sees the inhumanity within that rigid organization. At the same time, he starts to hear prophecies about his own kind of nature or destiny, being kind of a bringer of the apocalypse or Ragnarok or whatever, and he's really trying to find his own origins, find out more about these prophecies, but also trying to escape his own, air quotes, fate. And that leads him into these kind of wandering journeys. And I think that this is where the story took a departure for me that I really didn't expect. Growing up on those Del Toro films I mentioned earlier, I always kind of assumed for the most part that he stuck with the BPRD. And while those characters do come in and out a little bit as secondary characters in this run, once he leaves them, they're gone for a majority of this book. It really is just following Hellboy on his exploits after that. And that was something I really didn't see in the films, and it really took me off guard reading. I will say as well, I actually preferred in some ways the earlier arcs of this run, and I could have enjoyed more missions he had alongside the BPRD here in his main series. That's not to say I didn't like his solo ventures, but I just think that the earlier stuff for me was a little bit stronger. One thing I do think was stronger by the end is I like how everything culminated, and I also like the way Mignola built up this character. The more time I spent with Hellboy as a character, the more I was endeared to him. I thought he was pretty striking early on, but by the end, you just really come to care for who this character is. But yeah, in his journeys, he basically wanders the globe. He gets lost underwater for years, kind of hunted down by mermaids. He ends up in England at one point, and we actually find out, this is kind of a spoiler obviously, but we find out he's actually a direct descendant from King Arthur as well. We have him picking up Excalibur, and that he has another fate where he has to lead an army against kind of an evil witch, and that has all sorts of twists and turns. And all along the way, we have him kind of meeting up with old friends or old villains, getting into fights, trying to stop the bad, and also find out more about who he is, his nature, and what he's meant to do or not meant to do. So much of this is kind of a rejection of the destiny that's spelled out for him in the face of just free will and maturity. A lot of it is just an examination on what makes someone human in life, and some of it is just flat out action-packed dark fantasy, and honestly, it is a really gripping read from end to end. Ultimately, the story culminates with a final epic battle of Hellboy battling kind of this evil witch creature that, again, has just been building up for most of the series. The battle is absolutely climactic, interesting, dynamic, striking, and it ends with Hellboy saving the day, but at the cost of his own life. This time his heart is ripped out and he is cast into hell. And the final kind of story arcs are Hellboy in the underworld, kind of fighting things down there. And honestly, this almost feels like an interesting epilogue or kind of companion series after the fact. I really feel like the main storyline ended with his final battle in that castle against the witch creature, and everything after that, again, it just had a really different shift or change of pace, and we have him ultimately returning to the world of the living by the very, very end of this series, I believe. I do think he has further adventures in the pages of BPRD, if I'm not mistaken. Someone in the comments correct me if I'm wrong, but that's ultimately where the story leaves us. I do think that overall Mignola really paid off a lot of the plot threads that were sprinkled across the whole work, and while I would have personally loved to see more adventures with Hellboy in the BPRD, I did still like some of the stories we had after that point. Some of his wanderings led to a lot of philosophically interesting, thought-provoking kind of think questions. We have a lot of great artwork, of course, a lot of new, fun, supporting characters, villains, things for him to battle or figure out. And again, all along the way, we just had that stunning artwork from primarily Mignola, but also others that just really were captivating. This work was in many ways more complex than I would have felt going into it, and I honestly think that there's so many layers to this work that you could reread this and get something from it each time. I think the world that Mignola creates here is so immersive and interesting. Like I said, it's so entrenched in kind of folklore and myth as well that you feel like you have this blending of storytelling that goes back, in some cases, hundreds or thousands of years, and you have kind of new takes of familiar tropes or characters, and Hellboy himself just really stands out. Like I said, you have this kind of modern, salt-of-the-earth kind of character who just happens to be kind of visually monstrous. And I know I mentioned it at the top, but I do recommend this for more mature readers readers. They definitely do delve into the dark or kind of occult supernatural side of things. There are bits of nudity. Again, I'm trying to be sensitive in the course of this video. The nudity is usually non-sexualized. It's more on kind of grotesque monsters or in pieces of art in the background and things like that, rather than kind of graphic, gratuitous sex scenes. The violence is definitely pretty pervasive as well. Overall, it has just really grim and kind of darker tone. So of course, reader discretion advised, but I think this is more mature audience focused. An absolutely gripping and thought-provoking read. Monster-Sized Hellboy here really didn't disappoint. I was surprised how well it read. It was not as unyieldy as I would have expected at this size. It was put together really well, and I think it's just an overall pretty gorgeous edition. And that is Monster-Sized Hellboy from Dark Horse Comics. All that's left to do now is to give this book a grade. For one of the most epic dark fantasy sagas I have ever encountered in fiction, the Comic Book Report is happy to give Monster-Sized Hellboy by Mike Mignola from Dark Horse Comics an A. This is a classic piece of comic book history, and with good reason. This edition is larger than life and contains all the central stories. The art is absolutely gripping throughout. The overall storytelling and payoff is all pretty seamless in my mind. The central characters are all riveting, in many cases funny or humorous, and just plain memorable. This series was so different than what I had expected to be, and yet it exceeded just about every expectation I had. While the Monster-Sized edition does not include the short stories, I do like that we got the central kind of canon storylines for Hellboy all in a single volume. But these are just my thoughts about this title and this edition. You'll have to let me know yours. Have you read Hellboy, BPRD, or any of the Mignola-verse over at Dark Horse? What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear all about it in the comments section. Again, a huge thank you to our friends at Dark Horse for sending over this review copy, and until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your like, that comment we talked about, and maybe check out another video on your way out. Thanks, have a good one.